In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was initially passed by Congress and implemented in 1990. The definition of disability under the Americans with Disability Act is that an individual, to be a qualified person with a disability, is required to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of the individual. Now, the definition of a major life activity, or the inclusion of a major life activity, are things such as self-care, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, and working, learning and working. Now we're going to be talking later on about amendments in 2008 that change the ADA, but for right now, to lay the foundation, I'd just like to discuss the initial ADA. Secondly, the person must have a record of such an impairment, in other words, being treated medically, psychologically, being given medications, having surgeries, whatever it would establish a record, and then the concept of being regarded as having an impairment. And being regarded as having an impairment has also been modified, as we will see when I talk about changes to the ADA. There are several titles to the ADA, actually 5 different titles. The most important one for us in the rehabilitation field is the employment title. In the employment title, the ultimate goal of this title is to prevent discrimination of qualified individuals with a disability. And we just talked about the definition, broad definition. Discrimination includes, but is not limited to, not making reasonable accommodations, denying a job or benefits because of the person's disability, and using qualification standards to screen out individuals with disabilities. As we will see, this can be done or has been done, and that was one of the reasons why the ADA was modified. Now, as far as the employment section goes, there are 3 major areas that employers are obligated to abide by, and the ADA is the ADA covers employers with 15 or more employees. So if you have less than that, then you would not be covered under the terms of the ADA. The first area that the ADA requires in employment is that employers specify the essential functions of the job. The purpose of specifying essential functions is to enable the person with a disability to know whether he or she is going to be able to perform those functions. It's the obligation of the person with a disability to be able to state to an employer whether the person can perform those essential job functions. And this is the area of qualification standards to screen out individuals that was addressed. So for one example would be that employers cannot say at the bottom of a position description, other duties as assigned. And other duties as assigned would be such that a person with a disability may be unable to do other duties which are not specified but are potentially out there, cannot say, well, I'm not going to hire you because you can't do those potential other duties, whether or not those are expected at some point once the person has been employed. So essential functions of the job are required, and that includes both the physical and the mental demands of the work activity. Another factor that was addressed by the ADA when it was first developed back in the late 80s and began being implemented in the early 1990s is the requirement that employers be able to specify or be able to consider reasonable accommodations. And of course, reasonable accommodations will vary from position and situation to situation. And what a job performed in one location may have a different set of reasonable accommodations than another similar job in another location. The ADA basically was designed so that it wouldn't be an adversarial act. It wouldn't be one in which there'd be sanctions or penalties, although those were built into the act. But it was supposed to be something that would be worked out between the employer and the employee. And as part of kind of the transition between essential functions and reasonable accommodations, the employer is prohibited from asking about the disability. The employer is prohibited from doing a pre-employment physical or mental examination. Any such examination can be done, but it has to be after a job offer is made. And the idea underlying this is that the person with the disability basically is obligated to say whether he or she is able to physically and or mentally perform those essential job functions with or without a reasonable accommodation. And reasonable accommodation includes such things as making existing facilities used by employees readily accessible and usable by individuals with disabilities, and job restructuring, such as considering part-time employment, modified work schedules, reassignment to different positions, acquisition of equipment, adjustments to the work itself, development of training materials, the provision of qualified readers or interpreters, and other similar accommodations for persons with disabilities. So a reasonable accommodation would be to have an interpreter for someone who has a hearing impairment. An accommodation that would not be reasonable would be to hire somebody to work as a driver in a driving job if the person who's applying for it has a visual impairment that precludes driving. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer. So the reasonable accommodation would be such that the person with the disability is still able to perform the essential job functions, and that's a key factor here, that the individual is able to do the essential job functions with or without a, quote, reasonable accommodation. And as I said, reasonable is going to be viewed differently depending upon the location. And then the third component, which is also somewhat difficult to fully grasp because it's going to vary from place to place, is the concept of undue hardship. And undue hardship is an action requiring or the difficulty that an employer might have making the reasonable accommodation because of the expense involved in that accommodation. So a small employer, for example, may not be able to make an accommodation that a larger employer would be able to make. Under the ADA, undue hardship is something that is the obligation of the employer to determine. Although certainly if it gets to a litigation level, then the potential job applicant can certainly request information about why some accommodation would be an undue hardship. And obviously an undue hardship for or an accommodation for a larger employer is going to be different than for a smaller employer, depending upon the resources. that the employer has. So putting an elevator in to a building that doesn't have an elevator and was built without an elevator for an employer with 16 employees may be viewed as an undue hardship, but for a business that has 1,000 employees and more resources may not be viewed as an undue hardship. And again, these are all terms that are specific and issues that are specific to the situation at hand. One of the interesting things about the ADA, two interesting things, I guess. One would be that over the years since the ADA was implemented, and in particular the employment sections of the ADA, the federal courts have narrowed the definition of qualified individual with a disability, which led to the amendments in 2008 to the ADA. And the second interesting thing is that the employment provisions had more impact on persons already employed who developed a disability than on applicants who were applying for jobs from the outside. And that's not quite the way it was intended, but sometimes things don't work out as intended. The reason that occurred was because that second reason, the reason that occurred was because if someone applies for a job and there are 50 applicants for that same job, an employer can fall back and say, well, you know, we had 50 applicants, we only had one position, so you know, we had other qualified people who were better qualified to perform the essential job functions. And you know, that's also a judgment call on looking at someone's experience and background and qualifications. Whereas someone already employed and doing the job, if they acquire or develop a disability while employed, are in a better position to request an accommodation. So for example, if somebody does clerical work or data entry and develops carpal tunnel syndrome, then that person can request, let's say, an ergonomic keyboard or a different type of workstation. The bottom line in the employment provisions and the notion of employment of reasonable accommodation is that most accommodations are relatively inexpensive. They don't cost that much. And so many accommodations are very inexpensive to make for the work site. So a lot of fuss was made about something that did not turn into a major issue. The second title in the ADA relates to public services and services offered by private entities. And this includes ensuring that individuals with disabilities will be able to access and participate in services, programs, and benefits of local, state, and non-federal entities. And this would include such things as access to public transportation. That really was one of the major provisions of Title II and one of the major impacts of Title II. Title III relates to public accommodations that ensure that private businesses such as restaurants, movie theaters, hotels do not segregate individuals based on disability, and they provide aids for persons with sensory, visual, or hearing impairments and remove physical barriers. So accessibility would be one of the issues here. In such things as stores, department stores, having someone to assist with shopping would be considered an accommodation, removing the barrier that exists. Or accessibility into a building would be considered an accommodation under this title. And then the fourth title was telecommunications, and this requires telephone companies to utilize a relay service so individuals with hearing impairments can communicate via a TTD, and that televised public service announcements must have closed captioning. And the relay service has been certainly a boon to persons with hearing impairments. And then finally, Title V has to do with miscellaneous provisions, and this title explains the relationship between the ADA and other laws such as the Rehabilitation Act and also Education Acts, and differentiates as to what is not considered a disability and what is. For example, gender issues in the ADA initially were not considered to be a disability.